The Violinist of Meadow Hill. Chapter 1. The Assignment. I've written about conspiracy theorists who claim pigeons are government drones. I've interviewed a woman who insists her cat predicts lottery numbers. I once spent 3 days following a man who believed he was the reincarnation of a Tudor-era cheese merchant. So when my editor, Margaret, called me into her office, with that particular gleam in her eye, the one that says, "I've got something wonderfully ridiculous for you," I wasn't surprised. "There's an old man in Millbrook who plays violin on a hill," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Locals say he summons animals with his music." I picked up the folder without much enthusiasm. Millbrook was a 3-hour drive into the kind of countryside where people still waved at strangers, and the biggest news was usually someone's prize-winning marrow at the village fete. "Animals," I repeated flatly. "Wild animals. Deer, foxes, rabbits. Sometimes birds. They just appear when he plays." Margaret leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "The village Facebook group has about 200 posts about it. Half the town has witnessed it. Mass hysteria. Confirmation bias. Or he's feeding them before he plays. Probably. But it's August. News is slow. And I need 1,500 words by Friday on something that isn't another Brexit retrospective." She gave me that smile that wasn't really a smile. "Besides, when was the last time you left London? You're looking pasty, James." I glanced down at my arms. She had a point. "Fine. But if this turns out to be some old codger with a bag of bird seed and a YouTube channel, I'm billing you for the petrol." Margaret's not smile widened. "Deal." That's how I found myself driving through the rolling hills of Somerset 2 days later. My aging Volvo complaining about every incline. A voice on the radio discussing the finer points of agricultural subsidies. The countryside unfurled in shades of green I'd forgotten existed. Punctuated by sheep that looked like ambulatory clouds, and dry stone walls that had probably been standing since before my great-grandfather was born. Millbrook appeared around a bend like something from a period drama. All honey-colored stone cottages, a village green with an actual duck pond, and a pub called the Shepherd's Rest that looked older than the concept of plumbing. I parked in front of what Google Maps optimistically called the town center. Population, 847, according to a cheerfully weathered sign. And stepped out into air that smelled of cut grass and possibility. The local shop, which also served as the post office, apparently, had a bell above the door that tinkled when I entered. A woman in her 60s looked up from behind the counter, her reading glasses dangling from a beaded chain. "Help you, love? I'm looking for information about an old man who plays violin on a hill." I tried to sound casual, journalistic. "I'm a reporter from London." Her face lit up immediately. "Oh, you're here about Thomas. Wonderful. Yes, he plays every afternoon at 3 o'clock, weather permitting. Just head up Meadow Hill. You can't miss it. Big oak tree at the top. He'll be there." "The animals thing," I ventured. "Is it real?" She gave me a look that suggested I just asked if water was wet. "Of course it's real, dear. We've all seen it. My grandson took a video just last week. Deer came right up to the tree. Thomas just keeps playing like it's the most natural thing in the world. Has anyone asked him about it? Oh, we don't like to bother him. He's been through enough, poor soul." She leaned forward conspiratorially, though we were the only people in the shop. "Lost his wife 3 years ago. Evelyn, lovely woman. He started the violin playing not long after. Every single afternoon, rain or shine. Well, not rain, actually. He won't play in the rain. But you know what I mean." I bought a bottle of water and a somewhat optimistic-looking sandwich, thanked her for the information, and headed back to my car. Meadow Hill was apparently a 10-minute walk from the village centre. Up a footpath that began behind the church. The path wound through a meadow absolutely thick with wildflowers. Things I couldn't name in shades of purple and yellow and white. Butterflies zigzagged through the afternoon heat. I could hear birdsong layered in complex harmonies, and somewhere in the distance, a tractor rumbled. It was all aggressively pastoral, the kind of scene that made you understand why people wrote poems about the English countryside. The hill rose gently, and I could see the oak tree the shopkeeper had mentioned. A massive thing, its branches spreading like an umbrella. As I got closer, I could make out a figure beneath it. An old man, seated on what looked like a folding chair. A violin case beside him. I checked my watch. 2:47 p.m. If the locals were right, I was about to witness either a remarkable phenomenon or a complete waste of time. Probably the latter, but I'd been wrong before. Chapter 2. The music begins. I positioned myself about 50 yards away, leaning against a fence post where I could observe without being obvious about it. At 3 o'clock precisely. And I do mean precisely, because I was watching my phone. The old man opened his violin case with the careful movements of someone for whom every action required consideration. Thomas, if that was indeed his name, looked to be in his 80s. Thin in the way of very old men, with white hair that moved in the breeze, and hands that trembled slightly as he lifted the violin to his chin. He wore a cardigan despite the heat, and his trousers were held up with both a belt and suspenders. The kind of redundancy that suggested a superstition or bitter experience. For a long moment, he simply stood there, violin tucked under his chin, bow poised. He was looking out over the valley below, where the village sprawled in its picturesque way. Then, without preamble, he began to play. I'm not a classical music expert. My knowledge extends to recognizing Vivaldi's Four Seasons when it plays in cafes, and knowing that Mozart died young and probably didn't write Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but even I could tell that Thomas could play. Really play. The notes that drifted across the meadow were clear and pure, tinged with something I couldn't quite name. Melancholy, maybe, or longing. The melody was simple at first, almost like a folk tune. The kind of thing you'd hear at a country dance, all lilting and pastoral. I found myself relaxing into it. My reporter's skepticism softening despite myself. And then I saw the rabbit. It emerged from a hedgerow about 20 feet from the oak tree, nose twitching. A big one, brown with white patches. It hopped closer to the music. Paused. Hopped again. Stopped about 10 feet from Thomas and just sat there. Listening. Coincidence, I thought. Rabbits probably lived near that tree. Then came the fox. I actually did a double take when I saw it. A red fox, slim and elegant, trotting across the meadow with its tail streaming behind it. It should have sent the rabbit bolting. Instead, the fox sat down about 15 feet from Thomas, on the opposite side from the rabbit, and curled its tail around its feet. The rabbit didn't move. The fox didn't look at the rabbit. Okay, I muttered to myself. Okay, that's weird. The birds came next. I noticed because the random bird song I'd been hearing as background noise suddenly became organized, directional. They were flying toward the tree. Sparrows and finches and what I think were thrushes. Though as I mentioned, I'm not exactly David Attenborough. They settled in the branches above Thomas, and as near as I could tell, they'd gone silent. Not dead silent. I could hear the occasional chirp. But quiet. Listening. Then came the deer. 3 of them, emerging from the tree line at the edge of the meadow. They moved with that careful grace that deer have, all liquid motion and enormous eyes. They walked right up to the perimeter of what I was starting to think of as Thomas's concert hall. Maybe 20 feet from him. And stood there. The rabbit. The fox. The birds. The deer. all within 20 feet of an old man playing a violin on a hill. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Thomas played for about 40 minutes. The tune shifted and changed. Sometimes bright, sometimes sad, sometimes something in between that I didn't have words for. The animals stayed the entire time. More birds arrived. I spotted what might have been a badger at the tree line, though it didn't come closer. When Thomas finally lowered his violin, drawing out the last note until it faded into the breeze, the animals didn't immediately scatter. Instead, they dispersed slowly, almost reluctantly. The deer wandered back toward the trees. The fox trotted off in a different direction. The rabbit hopped away. The birds lifted off in groups, heading for other trees, other meadows. In 5 minutes, they were all gone. Thomas carefully placed his violin back in its case, closed the latches with a satisfying snap, and folded up his chair. He moved slowly but steadily, like someone following a long-established routine. Then he turned and started walking down the hill. Not toward me, thankfully, but along a different path that curved around the back of the hill. I stood there for a long moment, phone still in my hand, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Then I did what any reasonable reporter would do. I watched the video I'd just taken to make sure I wasn't having some kind of weird heat stroke hallucination. The animals were all there on the screen, clear as day. "Ha," I said aloud, to no one in particular. This was going to be a more interesting story than I'd thought. Chapter 3. The Investigation. The next morning, I set up shop in the Shepherd's Rest. It was the kind of pub that served breakfast until noon, and had newspapers so old they'd been read by at least 15 different people. I ordered something called a full English. That involved more fried things than I'd eaten in the past month, plus some mysterious items. Black pudding. Baked beans at breakfast? That I approached with caution. The bartender, a man named Nigel, who looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the pub, was my first proper interview. "Thomas Weatherby," he said, pulling a pint for a farmer who'd wandered in at what seemed like a very early hour to be drinking. "Lived here his whole life, mostly. Taught music at the grammar school 2 towns over for 40-odd years. Retired about 15 years back." "And his wife?" Nigel's face softened. "Evelyn. Lovely lady. Taught primary school in the village. They were one of those couples, you know? Never seen apart. She got sick about 4 years ago. Cancer. Fought it for a year, but..." He shook his head. "Thomas was devoted. Never left her side. After she passed, he just sort of shut down for a while. We worried about him." "When did he start playing on the hill?" "Maybe 6 months after she died. Year and a half after? Something like that. Started going up every afternoon like clockwork. Weather permitting, like I said. The animals showing up. That started almost immediately. First it was just birds, then rabbits, then bigger things. Now it's every day. The whole village knows about it. Has anyone asked him why they come?" Nigel gave me a look. "Would you? Man's grieving. We let him be." I spent the rest of the day talking to locals. Everyone had a theory, and everyone had seen it happen. The animals were drawn to the music. That much was clear. But why? "It's magic," said the shopkeeper's grandson, a teenager with spectacular hair and a TikTok account where he'd posted several videos of Thomas playing. 67,000 views on the most recent one. So much for this being a local secret. "It's probably the pitch," said the vicar, a young woman with sensible shoes and a degree in biology before she'd taken orders. "Animals respond to certain frequencies. Whales sing to each other across hundreds of miles. Birds have regional dialects. Maybe his playing hits some frequency that's particularly appealing." "It's love," said an elderly woman I found sitting on a bench by the duck pond. He plays for Evelyn. The animals can hear it. That evening, I sat in my room at the village's only B&B. Run by a chatty woman named Deirdre who made a full pot of tea appear every time I looked remotely thirsty. And reviewed my notes. I had witnessed something extraordinary. I had it on video. Multiple witnesses had confirmed it happened every day. But I didn't have the why. And more importantly, I didn't have Thomas's story. Not really. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd talk to him directly. Ask the questions that the villagers were too polite to ask. I pulled out my laptop and started writing, trying to capture what I'd seen in words that wouldn't sound completely mad. Outside my window, the summer evening stretched long and golden. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 7 times. My phone buzzed. Margaret. Well? Her text read. I typed back. It's real. Whatever it is, it's real. 3 dots appeared, then. I want pictures. Got video. I sent back. Good. Also, I'm extending your deadline. This is page 3 material. Maybe front page if you find the right angle. Give me 3,000 words. I looked at my notes. At a video on my phone. At the view out the window. Yeah, I muttered. No pressure. Chapter 4. Thomas. The next afternoon, I arrived at Meadow Hill at 2:45. This time, I didn't hide behind a fence post. I walked straight up the hill and approached the oak tree where Thomas was setting up his chair. He looked up as I approached, unsurprised. His eyes were a watery blue, sharp despite his age. You're the reporter, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir. James Fletcher. I was wondering if I could talk to you. Not now, he interrupted, but not unkindly. After. You can stay and listen if you keep quiet and don't disturb them. Them? He gestured vaguely at the meadow. They're on their way. I sat down on the grass about 30 feet away. Far enough to be respectful, close enough to hear. At 3 o'clock, Thomas began to play. This time, knowing what to expect, I watched more carefully. The animals did come. The same types as before, though not necessarily the same individuals. Today there were 4 deer, 2 foxes, countless birds, several rabbits, and something that might have been a weasel. They arranged themselves in that same loose circle around Thomas, and they listened. But I wasn't just watching the animals. I was watching Thomas. He played with his eyes closed, most of the time. His thin body swayed slightly with the music. And on his face was an expression I'd seen before, usually at funerals or in hospital rooms. The look of someone talking to someone who isn't there. When he finished, I waited while he packed up. The animals dispersed as they had before, slowly and almost regretfully. All right, Thomas said, settling back into his chair with a slight groan. Ask your questions. But I'll tell you now, I don't know why they come. I pulled out my notebook. How long have you been doing this? 3 years. Near enough. Started about 6 months after Evelyn died. Your wife? Yes. His voice was steady, matter of fact. Married 56 years. I'm sorry for your loss. He nodded, accepting the condolence with the grace of someone who'd heard it many times. She was the better part of me. People say that. But with Evelyn, it was true. I was a mediocre music teacher who got irritable with students. She was the one who could get through to anyone. Made everyone feel seen. Did she play music? No. Tone deaf, actually. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. He smiled at the memory. But she loved to listen to me play. That was our evening routine, for decades. After dinner, I'd play for an hour. She'd sit in her chair with her knitting or a book, and I'd play. Brahms, Vivaldi, folk tunes, whatever struck my fancy. And after she died? His hands tightened on the arm of his chair. I couldn't play. Not for months. Tried once and just broke down. Put the violin away. Thought I might never play again. What changed? A dream. He looked out over the valley, his eyes distant. I dreamed she came to me, clear as day, and she said, "Thomas, you're not done yet. You promised." When I woke up, I remembered. Remembered what? The promise I made her. The week before she died, when we both knew she wasn't going to recover, I asked her what she wanted me to do. After. She was very weak by then, but she took my hand and said, "Play for me. Every day. Even when I'm not there to listen, play for me. Promise me you won't stop." His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence. I waited, giving him a moment. "So I promised," he continued. "But after she died, I forgot. The grief. It swallows everything. But then I had that dream, and I remembered. So I came up here. We used to walk up here together, you see, it was one of her favorite spots. And I played. And the animals came. Not right away. First day, there was just a single bird. A robin, I think. Sat in the tree above me the whole time. Second day, more birds. By the end of the first week, rabbits started showing up. Then deer. Then foxes. Now. He gestured at the meadow. Now they all come. Do you have any theory why? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was soft. Evelyn always said music was a language everyone understood. Not just people. Everyone. She said when I played, I was speaking to the whole world, whether I knew it or not. I think maybe she was right. Maybe they hear what I'm trying to say. Which is? That I loved her. That I still love her. That love doesn't end just because someone's gone. He looked at me directly. You think that's foolish? An old man being sentimental? No, I said, and I meant it. I think it's the best reason I've heard. He nodded, seeming satisfied. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the evening light slant across the valley. Will you write about this? He asked. Yes. If that's all right with you. It's fine. People are curious. That's natural. But I hope you'll tell them the truth. Which is? That the magic isn't in the music. It's in keeping a promise. That's all I'm doing, every day. Keeping my word to the person I loved most in the world. He stood slowly, gathering his violin case and chair. Write that, and you'll have your story. Chapter 5. The Promise. That evening, I sat in the pub with my laptop and a pint of something local. Called Shepherd's Delight, which seemed on brand. And tried to write. I'd gone into this expecting a quirky human interest piece. Eccentric old man, with animal behavior, maybe some light science about frequencies and wildlife patterns. 500 words, a couple of photos, done. Instead, I had something much bigger. A love story. A story about grief and promises and the strange ways that beauty persists in the world. I wrote for 3 hours straight, barely touching my dinner. The words came easily, which was rare for me. Usually, writing felt like pulling teeth. But this story wanted to be told. Around 9 o'clock, Nigel came over and refilled my pint without being asked. You talked to Thomas, he said. Statement, not a question. I did. He tell you about Evelyn? He did. Nigel nodded, satisfied. Good. People should know. She was special, that woman. He's special too, for keeping his promise the way he does. Do you think the animals really are responding to something in the music? Some frequency we can't understand? Nigel shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe they just recognize the sound of love. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for. He wiped down the bar thoughtfully. My grandmother used to say that dogs could tell good people from bad people just by looking at them. Maybe it's like that. Maybe when Thomas plays, they hear something true, and they want to be part of it. After Nigel wandered away, I opened a new document and started making notes for a follow-up piece. Because this wasn't just a single story. This was something that could be expanded, explored. I could write about the science of animals and sound. The psychology of grief and ritual. The importance of keeping promises. But I kept coming back to the simplest interpretation. An old man loved his wife so much that he plays for her every single day. And somehow, the world notices. The world listens. The next morning, before I left Millbrook, I drove up to Meadow Hill one last time. Thomas was there, of course, at 3 o'clock exactly. I sat on the grass at a respectful distance and watched as the animals gathered. Today there were more deer than before. 5 of them, including a young fawn that stayed close to its mother. The foxes were there, and the rabbits, and the birds. And there was something new. A badger, old in the afternoon light, waddling up to sit at the edge of the circle. Thomas played beautifully. The melody today was something I thought I recognized. A folk song, maybe, something old and a little bit sad but also hopeful. The animals listened with that same rapt attention. When he finished, I stayed where I was, not wanting to intrude. Thomas packed up his violin and chair, gave me a small nod of acknowledgement, and walked down the hill. I sat there for a while after he left, in the golden afternoon light, thinking about love and loss and the promises we make. In the tree above me, a bird sang something complex and beautiful. My phone buzzed. Margaret. How's the story coming? I looked out over the valley, at the village below, at the meadow with its wildflowers and the scattering animals. It's done. I typed back. I'll send it tonight. Good or great? I thought about Thomas's face when he played. About the animals gathering. About a promise kept. Day after day. For 3 years. It's true. I wrote. That's better than either. Chapter 6. Publication. The article ran on the front page of the weekend edition. Margaret had titled it, "The Violinist of Meadow Hill. One man's promise to his wife draws wildlife from miles around." The photo desk had done something clever with one of my videos. A still shot of Thomas playing. With the deer in the foreground, birds in the branches above, and the valley spreading out behind him in glorious late afternoon light. My phone started ringing around 7 in the morning. Breakfast television wanted me for an interview. Radio programs. A documentary crew. Someone from the TV asking if Thomas would be willing to be filmed. I forwarded everything to Deirdre at the B&B, who'd given me Thomas's phone number with strict instructions to be respectful or I'll have your head, and let her pass on the messages. Then I drove back to London, thinking about my own life. My own promises. Kept and broken. My ex-wife, who I disappointed in small ways until they added up to something insurmountable. The article went viral in that peculiar British way. Trending on Twitter, shared thousands of times on Facebook, discussed on Radio 4. Americans picked it up too. I did 3 transatlantic interviews with morning shows, explaining repeatedly that no, it wasn't fake, and yes, the animals really did gather every single day. The scientific community weighed in. A zoologist from Oxford wrote a piece about animal responses to regular patterns and sounds. A musician analyzed Thomas's playing style and noted that he played in frequencies particularly appealing to wildlife. Everyone had a theory. But the public didn't care about the theories. They cared about Thomas and Evelyn. People started making pilgrimages to Millbrook, respectfully watching from a distance as Thomas played. The village shop started selling postcards. The pub created a drink called Evelyn's Memory. Proceeds to a local cancer charity. Thomas, to his credit, took it all in stride. When I called him a week after publication to apologize for the circus, he laughed. "It's fine, lad. People need stories like this. They need to know that love persists. That promises matter. If our story gives them that, Evelyn would have been pleased." Would she really? Oh, definitely. She loved being the center of attention. I could hear the smile in his voice. She'd have hated dying, but she'd have loved being famous after it. I found myself laughing too. I'm glad it worked out. So am I. And James? Thank you. For telling it right. For understanding what it was really about. After we hung up, I sat in my flat in London, looking out at the grey sky and the endless buildings, and thought about the green hills of Somerset. About an old man keeping a promise. About animals gathering to listen to the language of love. I'd written hundreds of articles in my career. Exposés and investigations and feature pieces. I'd won awards. Been nominated for more. This was just a human interest story about an old man and his violin. But I thought it might be the best thing I'd ever done. Chapter 7. The Return. 6 months later, on a crisp February afternoon, I found myself driving back to Millbrook. The hills were different in winter. Bare trees, brown fields, grey skies that promised rain. But the village was the same, cozy and self-contained, smoke rising from chimneys. I'd kept in touch with Thomas through occasional emails and phone calls. He still played every afternoon, weather permitting. And apparently his definition of permitting was fairly generous. He'd played through several snowstorms, he told me, much to the concern of the locals. The animals still came, though he said there were fewer of them in winter. They've got other things to worry about, he'd explained. Finding food, staying warm. Can't blame them for prioritizing. I checked into the B&B. Deirdre greeted me like a long-lost nephew and immediately produced tea and biscuits. And walked up to Meadow Hill around 2:30. Thomas was already there, setting up his chair. He wore a much heavier coat now, and a woolly hat that made him look like he was about to go Arctic exploring. "James," he called out when he saw me. "Didn't expect you back. Thought I'd see how you were doing. Make sure you haven't been buried in fan mail." He chuckled. "Oh, there's been some of that. Some very kind people sending letters. I try to reply to all of them. Evelyn would have wanted that." I settled onto the grass. Significantly colder and damper than it had been in August. And wrapped my coat tighter around myself. "Do you ever get tired of it?" I asked. "Playing every single day?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Some days it's harder than others. When it's cold like this, or when my arthritis acts up, or when I'm just feeling low." But then I remember her face when I played for her. How she'd close her eyes and smile. How she said it made her feel like the world was good. He paused. "So no. I don't get tired of it. If anything, it gets easier. More necessary." At 3 o'clock, he began to play. The animals came. Fewer, as he'd said. 2 deer, a fox, some birds that looked extraordinarily puffed up against the cold. But they came, and they listened, and there was something almost defiant about it. Nature saying, even in the dead of winter, even when everything is hard, beauty persists. Promises are kept. Thomas played for his usual 40 minutes. The melody was different today. Something slower, more contemplative. It suited the winter afternoon, the bare branches, the grey sky. When he finished, I helped him pack up his things. A new routine, since my article had come out and we'd become, if not quite friends, then friendly. We walked down the hill together, Thomas moving carefully on the frosty grass. "I've been thinking," he said as we walked, "about what happens when I can't do this anymore. When I'm too old or too sick, or when I finally shuffle off this mortal coil." "Don't talk like that. I'm 83, lad. It's not morbid, it's practical." He smiled. "But here's what I think. Someone will take it over. Someone will come up here and play, or sing, or read poetry, or just sit and appreciate the view. The important thing isn't the music specifically. It's the attention. The act of showing up, of saying, this matters, this place matters, beauty matters." That's very philosophical. I've had a lot of time to think about it. 3 years of thinking, every afternoon. We'd reached the bottom of the hill. Thomas turned to look back up at the oak tree. "Evelyn was right, you know. About music being a language everyone understands. But more than that, she understood that showing up matters. That consistency matters. That keeping your word, day after day, year after year. That's what builds something real. I should write that down. You write too much already. Live more." He patted my shoulder. "But if you do write it, spell my name right this time. You had it as Weathersby in paragraph 12. I winced. "Sorry about that." Evelyn would have laughed. She had a good sense of humor about mistakes. He started walking toward his cottage at the edge of the village. "Come for dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup and bread. But I'd enjoy the company. I'd like that." We walked through the village together as the early winter darkness began to fall. Lights were coming on in cottage windows. Someone was burning wood. I could smell it on the cold air. It was peaceful in a way that London never was. Quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. Over soup. Surprisingly good. Apparently Thomas had learned to cook after Evelyn died. And crusty bread. We talked about everything and nothing. His former students, some of whom still wrote to him. My work, which had gotten busier after the article's success. The state of the world, which we both agreed was a mess but might yet be salvageable. "You should find someone," Thomas said, apropos of nothing. "Get married again. I know you're divorced. How? You mentioned it in one of your emails. Also, you have that look. The look of someone who knows what he's lost." He broke off a piece of bread. "I'm not saying marry the first person you meet. But don't give up on it. Partnership, companionship. It's what we're built for. I'm not sure I'm very good at it. Nobody is, at first. Evelyn and I had some spectacular rows when we were young. Once she threw a plate at me. Missed, thankfully, but left a dent in the wall. We kept it as a reminder. A reminder of what? That passion is messy. That love means caring enough to get angry sometimes. That making something work requires both people to keep showing up, even when it's hard." He looked at me over his glasses. "You strike me as someone who gives up too easily. Who leaves when things get complicated." He wasn't wrong. I had left. I'd walked out of my marriage when it got hard, telling myself I was doing us both a favor, that we wanted different things, that it was kinda this way. All probably true. But also, I'd quit. "What would you do differently?" I asked. "If you had to do it all over again?" Thomas thought about it. "I'd learned to do the dishes sooner. Evelyn nagged me about that for years." He smiled. "But seriously? I'd pay attention more. Be present. It's easy to sleepwalk through life, to let days blur together. I'd try harder to make every day count, to notice the small things. The way she smiled at her own jokes. How she hummed when she was cooking. The sound of her reading to herself before bed. You remember all that? Of course. Those are the things that matter. Not the big dramatic moments. Everyone remembers those. It's the daily details that make a life. He stood to clear the dishes. That's what I'm doing up on that hill, really. Remembering the details. Keeping them alive. I left Millbrook the next morning, but I took something with me. Not just a follow-up article idea. Though Margaret would be pleased about that. Something harder to define. A reminder, maybe, that consistency matters. That showing up matters. That the promises we make to each other, the big ones and the small ones, are what give life shape and meaning. I still think about Thomas sometimes, especially on grey days when London feels too loud and too big. I picture him on his hill, playing for someone who can't hear him except in memory. I think about the animals gathering, responding to something they can't name but recognize nonetheless. I think about a promise, kept faithfully, day after day after day. And I think about the fact that love doesn't end just because someone's gone. It changes shape, maybe. Becomes music instead of conversation, memory instead of presence. But it persists. Like Thomas said. It persists. 3 years later, I heard through Deirdre that Thomas had passed away quietly in his sleep. He was 86. The village gave him a funeral that would have made Evelyn proud. Half the town turned out, and some. I later learned it was one of his former students, now a professional violinist. Played at the service. They played the same folk melody Thomas had played that first day I'd watched him, the one that sounded like love translated into notes. I drove down for the funeral. Stood in the back of the church and listened to people share their memories of Thomas and Evelyn. Their dedication to their students. Their kindness. The way they'd made everyone feel seen and valued. After the service, a group of villagers walked up Meadow Hill. It wasn't planned, exactly. It just seemed like the right thing to do. About 30 of us made the climb, standing in a loose circle under the oak tree where Thomas had played for 6 years straight. The vicar said a few words. Someone else read a poem. And then Thomas's former student, a woman in her 40s named Sarah, lifted her violin and began to play. She played the same melody Thomas had played every afternoon. And I'll swear on anything you like, this is the absolute truth. The animals came. Not as many as when Thomas played. But they came. A few deer at the tree line. Birds settling in the branches. A single fox, sitting at the edge of the meadow, watching. Sarah played for about 10 minutes, tears running down her face. When she finished, she lowered her violin and said, "I'll come back. Once a week, at least. It shouldn't stop." He wouldn't want it to stop. Several other people volunteered too. Not every day. Nobody could commit to that except Thomas. But regularly. Once a week. Twice a month. Whenever they could. "We'll keep the promise going," Nigel said, his voice gruff. "Between all of us, we'll manage it." And they did. I know because I check in with Deirdre every few months, and she sends me updates. There's a rotating schedule now. Sarah comes every Sunday at 3 o'clock. A retired teacher named Malcolm comes on Wednesdays. Thomas's grandson, who just started learning violin, comes on Saturdays with his father, who reads poetry when the boy's fingers get too tired. The animals still come. Not always, and not in the same numbers, but they come. The promise persists. I'm writing this now from my flat in London. But things are different than they were when this story started. I'm seeing someone. Her name is Rachel, she's a librarian, and she's patient with my odd hours and tendency to disappear into work. We're taking it slow. Both of us carrying our own histories, our own broken promises. But we're showing up. Day after day, we're showing up. Last week, she asked me about the story that changed everything. The one about the old man and his violin. I told her the whole thing, start to finish. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Do you think it was really the music that drew the animals? She asked. Or something else? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe it was the frequency. Maybe it was routine. They learned to associate that time and place with safety. Maybe it was something we don't have words for yet. Or maybe, she said, they just recognized the sound of someone keeping a promise. And they wanted to witness it. I think she might be right. Thomas taught me something important, though it took me a while to understand it. It's not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about showing up. About doing the thing you said you'd do, even when it's cold, even when it's hard, even when no one would blame you for quitting. It's about the promises we make and the promises we keep. And it's about understanding that love, real lasting love, isn't just a feeling. It's a practice. It's a choice you make every single day. I think about Thomas on his hill, playing for someone who couldn't hear him anymore, keeping a promise because that's what you do when you love someone. Not because it's easy. Not because anyone's watching. But because you said you would, and your word means something. The animals understood that, somehow. They heard something true in his music and they gathered to bear witness to it. To say, in their own way, this matters. This is important. This is what it means to love. I hope, when my time comes, that I'll have kept even half the promises Thomas kept. That I'll have loved even half as well. And I hope that somewhere, in whatever comes after, Evelyn is still listening to him play. Because some promises don't end just because we do. They persist.